What if you could build the perfect world? No hunger, no predators, no disease, no war, no shortage of food, and nothing standing between you and a comfortable life. It sounds like paradise, but in 1968, a scientist created something remarkably close to that paradise. Not for humans, for mice. He gave them almost everything they could possibly need, and then he watched something terrifying happen. The mice didn't starve, they didn't freeze, they weren't hunted. Their food supply never ran out. Instead, their society began to fall apart, and eventually the population stopped reproducing. This experiment became known as Universe 25, and the strange pattern discovered inside it would later become associated with something called the Calhoun effect. In July of 1968, researcher John Calhoun introduced 8 mice into a specially designed enclosure. 4 males, 4 females. These weren't random mice, they were healthy and carefully selected, and their new home was unlike anything a mouse had experienced before. There was plenty of food, plenty of water, nesting material, a controlled temperature, protection from predators, and no disease threatening the colony. The environment was designed to eliminate many of the ordinary reasons a mouse might die. In other words, Calhoun had removed almost every external threat. There was just one thing he couldn't completely eliminate: other mice. At first, nobody knew what would happen. Would the population grow endlessly? Would the mice simply live comfortably together? Or would something completely unexpected happen when the colony became crowded? The experiment had begun. For the first several months, everything looked normal. The mice explored their new environment. They established territories. They built nests. And most importantly, they reproduced. The population began increasing rapidly. At one point, the number of mice was doubling roughly every 55 days. It looked like the experiment was working exactly as planned. The colony was thriving. But then the population passed a critical stage. By around day 315, there were more than 600 mice inside Universe 25. And suddenly, the growth slowed down. This was strange. There was still food. Still water, still nesting space. The environment wasn't running out of resources. So what was stopping the population? The answer seemed to be hiding in the way the mice were interacting with one another. The mice were no longer spreading evenly throughout the enclosure. They began concentrating in certain areas. Thousands of interactions were happening inside the same limited social environment. And the normal structure of mouse society began changing. Some males became extremely aggressive. Others were repeatedly pushed away from social groups. Some stopped defending territories altogether, some stopped attempting to mate, and the females began experiencing their own problems. Mothering behavior deteriorated. Some mothers abandoned their pups, others became aggressive toward them. The colony wasn't running out of food. It was running out of something harder to measure: normal social behavior. And then something even stranger appeared. Calhoun observed mice that seemed to withdraw from the entire social system. They weren't the dominant fighters. They weren't competing for territory. They weren't trying to establish themselves in the hierarchy. They mostly ate, slept, and groomed themselves. They avoided fighting, they avoided mating, they avoided the social competition happening around them. Calhoun eventually referred to some of these males as the beautiful ones. The name wasn't about physical beauty. It described mice that appeared healthy on the outside, but had essentially withdrawn from the social world. And this created a disturbing paradox. The mice were physically capable of surviving, but they were increasingly incapable of participating in the society around them. Then the consequences became impossible to ignore. Birth rates fell. Young mice were increasingly exposed to abnormal social conditions. Normal courtship became less common. Mothering became less reliable. And the generation growing up inside the collapsing colony seemed less capable of rebuilding the social structure that had been lost. The population was still alive, but something fundamental had changed. And that distinction matters, because Universe 25 wasn't simply a story about overcrowding. It was a story about what happened when social relationships began breaking down faster than the population could recover. And once that process started, it became extremely difficult to reverse. Eventually, the population reached its peak. Roughly 2,200 mice were living inside Universe 25. Then came the point Calhoun had been watching for. Reproduction almost completely stopped. The colony could no longer replace itself. Even though food and water remained available, the number of new mice continued falling. The adults grew older. The younger generation became increasingly disconnected from normal social behavior. And eventually, there were no more surviving young. The population had entered a one-way decline. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was something slower, more unsettling. The colony was dying because it had lost the ability to continue itself. And this is where Universe 25 becomes much more than a strange experiment with mice. Because Calhoun wasn't only interested in mice, He was interested in what their behavior might tell us about social organization, and people immediately began asking a disturbing question. Could something similar happen to humans? Imagine a society where food is abundant. Technology handles most physical labor. Entertainment is available instantly. Communication is possible with almost anyone on Earth. And survival becomes easier than it was for previous generations. Would people automatically become happier? Would society become healthier? Or could something else become important? Purpose, connection, status, belonging, meaning. Now, before we go any further, there's an important problem with using Universe 25 as a prediction for humanity. Humans are not mice. The experiment was performed in a highly controlled artificial environment. Humans have language, culture, institutions, technology, the ability to redesign our environments. And unlike the mice, we can recognize problems and deliberately change our behavior. So Universe 25 does not prove that human civilization will collapse because of overcrowding. The experiment itself has also been criticized, and its direct relevance to humans remains disputed. But that doesn't make the experiment meaningless. It makes the question more interesting. Because perhaps the lesson isn't humans will become like the mice. Perhaps the lesson is simply this: survival requires more than resources. Think about a modern city. Millions of people can live within a few miles of one another, and someone can still feel completely alone. You can have hundreds of followers online and still have nobody you can truly talk to. You can have endless entertainment and still feel bored. You can have more information than any human generation before you and still struggle to find meaning. None of this proves that modern society is becoming Universe 25. It doesn't. But it gives us an interesting question. What exactly makes a society healthy? Is it food, safety, comfort, technology, or is there another ingredient that can't be measured as easily? Maybe that's why the Calhoun effect continues to fascinate people decades later. Not because a group of mice somehow predicted the future, but because they demonstrated something uncomfortable about behavior. A population can have enough resources and still experience collapse. A creature can be physically healthy and still become socially disconnected. And a comfortable environment doesn't automatically create a healthy society. The experiment leaves us with a question that is much harder to answer than it first appears. What do living beings actually need beyond survival? Because perhaps the most dangerous situation isn't having too little. Perhaps it's having everything you need to survive, while slowly losing the reasons to connect, reproduce, cooperate, and care. Universe 25 was built as a paradise for 8 mice. But somewhere along the way, paradise became a prison. And the most unsettling part isn't what happened to the mice, it's the fact that decades later, we're still asking why.